Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hello there and welcome to another installment of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so delighted that you join us today as part of these ongoing conversations that we are having with incredible leaders from around the world, from within Australia, who are planting churches, who are thought leaders, particularly designed to encourage particularly the Australian church in this moment. And today we are joined by a close personal friend of mine, a brother from New Zealand, Sam Harvey, who along with his wife, Jen, have planted and lead Bay Vinyard Church. And I'm just so delighted that today, Sam, you join us and we'd be able to ask some questions of your journey and just share some of your reflections with us today.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, and it's good as a Kiwi just to be able to speak into the Australian context and tidy a few things up, actually, so not surprised quite early into the journey of this podcast you've had to go over the ditch, so here to help, bro.
The amount of Kiwis that we've had significantly impact the Australian church, it's no surprise.
No, you're too kind.
For those who wouldn't have heard of you, for to hear your name and to hear some of your journey today for the first time, I wonder if you just give us a bit of a snapshot of some of your journey, where you've come from, your family, what has found you where you are today leading Bay Vinyard.
Yeah, cool. So I'm married to my beautiful wife, Jen. We've got 3 boys, keep us very busy, 7, 9 and 11. I grew up in the Anglican church. My father's an Anglican vicar. And when I was 8 years old, we left New Zealand and church planted in South America, in Uruguay. And so that was a very formative experience in my childhood and a very rich time, but challenging time for us as a family. Moved back to New Zealand. My dad continued to pastor an Anglican church, charismatic Anglican church, which has just been a real gift to me over the years in terms of just both a real appreciation of thinking and depth and the scriptures, but also a love of the Holy Spirit and a desire for all of that side of things. And so out of high school, I don't think I felt a call to ministry, but I just didn't, there's this sort of pressure about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And I don't really know. But I did sense this thing of it's probably a good idea to study the Bible. It won't be wasted. And so I went to Bible college and studied theology for 3 years, got my degree there, and then have just been in full-time ministry ever since for the last 19 years. And so I'm now pastor of a vineyard church, but was involved in the Anglican church for a little while and that sort of thing. And so for 15 years, I was an apprentice, it felt like. I was 2IC or helping out in different capacities on staff. But 5 years ago, me and my wife moved here and we just felt very, very called, which came out of left field. I'd actually said publicly, I don't want a church plant. It looks really tough. I'd far rather turn up into a church and try and change the culture. But the Lord had other ideas, and I'm so grateful for that. So we went on the adventure of our life 5 years ago, very clearly called to plant. And we've moved to a city where we had no history. We sort of effectively parachuted in, but long discernment process and felt very called here. So 4 years ago, our church officially started. And it's just been it's been amazing, but a bit of a challenge over the time as well, particularly with COVID and all that sort of stuff in the mix. But so that's sort of a Reader's Digest sort of snapshot of how we got here.
That's good. I'd love to ask more about some of the stresses that you just mentioned, but maybe we'll get to that in a couple of questions' time. Maybe, Sam, you could just kind of talk to our audience today just about that call. Like you mentioned, you felt a strong call and what that meant as you went about kind of working out what that would look like for Bay Vinyard, like particularly by way of models and funding and just a heart for what the Lord was doing in and through you as the planters and what that looked like coming into a new space. Like that's different for everybody. But I know that particularly church planters get quite encouraged as they hear other stories of that.
Yeah. Well, we definitely saw God's provision in incredible ways as we stepped out in faith. I think the discernment phase is super important because the call will be tested and tested deeply. And the thing that gets you through those incredibly tough times and times of sacrifice is the call. And it's like, oh, I'd love to walk away, but the call's too deep. I just know that God's called us to this. And so the story sort of started for us. Me and my wife, just about every night, we'll just have a little prayer before we go to sleep. And normally that, certainly when the kids were little, it was like, Lord, if you're real, please, can they sleep through the night? And that sort of, very selfish prayers. And that was about it. But on this particular night, we just began to pray and we just continued to pray. And there was a sense of stirring and unsettling. And within about an hour of praying and chatting, we just knew in our Noah, deep down, that God was calling us to leave the city that we're in, the church that we're in, that we're very happy in. And so then that process of discernment took about 3 months, where we invited a very close core of wise and spiritual mentors for us to challenge and speak into and pray with us in discerning the call initially just to leave where we were. And then once we just knew we tested that and we'd gone through the whole process of discernment around leaving, the next question was where. And that was such a beautiful feeling. Like, just to, John Wimber used to have this statement. He said, God, I'm just loose change in your hands. Spend me how you want. Now, that was back in the day when you had cash in your hand and the rest of it. These days, it's more, an EFTPOS card in your hand. God, spend me how you want. But that we were like that. It was like, God, it was so lovely in the sense of like, man, we're just all yours. Tell us where. And so it was like, let's start with the world. Are you calling us to cross-cultural mission? And pretty quickly it was like, no, we just feel so called to New Zealand. We love New Zealand. We feel called to serve the church here in New Zealand. And so then it was like, well, where? And our national director at the time gave us some great advice. He said, God's no is normally clearer than his yes. So he says, my advice to you is you get your feet on the ground in a bunch of centers where you think God might be calling you, and then you just discern whether you think it could be God. And he said, God's no will be clearer than his yes. So we did that. We went to a bunch of centers that we had history in, or that we thought maybe this could be it. And man, it was so true. God's no was so clear. And it surprised us a few times. And then again, our national director was like, mate, why don't you check out the Hawke's Bay, which is where we now live on the east coast of New Zealand. He said, I think you're a great fit there. And we're like, okay, so we jumped on a plane and went there, and it wasn't a no. And then we drove around some more, and Jen started crying because she realized we're going to be leaving, to move here. And there was some grief that began to, and I began, I don't know, there's something just happened in our hearts, and it was like, it's here. And so then we just pulled the trigger and just began to work out how that could look. And I had nothing in terms of training on church planting. I mean, zero, because this hadn't been on my radar. All of a sudden, I'm really interested in church planting. And so then I saw that there was a church planting training thing run by an outfit called ARC, Association of Related Churches. I'd never heard of them, but I was like, whatever, man. Like, if they're training things, that was in 10 days' time in Australia. So I was like, my passport was out of date. I did the flipping quick, let's get the passport thing sorted, paid the extra money, and was on a plane 9 days later to this training thing, which for 2 days. And that was just super helpful for us in terms of like, hey, it built faith around hearing stories of church plants, and it gave us something of a model or a recipe that we could draw from, which we did. Now, as things have evolved, we're not an ARC church in terms of our DNA or anything like that, but I'm just grateful for them, because it was like, it was training and support and finance. They had a whole financial system that was super helpful. And so we just kind of did what they suggested you should do, and started gathering a team. And the interesting thing about parachuting, and we had a couple of other families that joined us from Christchurch who made some massive sacrifice to move up with us and that sort of thing. But the thing that was interesting about church planting that way, and there's lots of, I think you can critique all the different ways of planting a church. They've all got their strengths and weaknesses. We attracted a bunch of people, and this is what we said to folks when they arrived at our interest gatherings and stuff. We said, we don't want you to leave your church. I'm just not interested in transfer growth. I want to see the kingdom of God advance. So I'm not interested in that. But we feel very called here to plant a church. And if God calls you to join us, like clearly calls you, and we'll help you with that discernment, and we'll tell you to stay in your church if we don't think you're leaving for the right reason. But if God's calling you to partner with us, then that's a whole different thing. And we've got to try and work out what that journey looks like in terms of leaving wherever you are planted well to partner with what God is calling us to do together. And so we just did our best to do that with integrity, because I'm still in the minister's fraternal kind of thing here in the Hawke's Bay. These are now my friends. I didn't want to turn up to pillage their church to build my empire. Absolutely not. I want to see the kingdom of God advance in this place and churches flourish. But inevitably what happens is that when you plant a new church, there's people called switchers. And what switchers do is that they'll be in a church community. They're not there for short time. They're there for sort of medium-ish normally. They're there for 2 or 3 years. And there's a sense of progress and traction for folk like that. But there's some brokenness there that means that they struggle to get past that sort of amount of time into a genuine nitty-gritty community. So over time, we've had people that switched into us and then switched out. But over the last 4 years, a really beautiful and healthy cause formed in our church, and now we're starting to really, I think, do the good work of discipleship and dream about the future in terms of our church and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
That's beautiful, Sam. And yeah, I equally share that passion for discerning God's will in planting. I think is such a crucial part of the journey, and one that is often underrated. Of course, particularly here in Australia, and on behalf of Exponential, we want to see many more churches planted, but in ways that have been birthed by God, ways that are clearly the calling and the authority of God to see many more churches planted in our country.
The first guy I talked to, who's just a legend, he's the one I talked to. He's the first guy I brought into the inner circle, and he said to me, "Sam, I've seen a lot of pastors make dumb decisions in their 30s." First thing he said to me. So let's just discern together whether this is God or whether that was the curry last night, And it's like, I'm so grateful, because it wasn't yes men and women that we had around us. It was people praying and fasting and discerning whether this was the Lord or not. Because it's very hard to discern on your own. My thing is, the bigger the decision and the more that it's going to impact other people, particularly if you're leaving a church to do the higher the threshold in terms of the demands for discernment are in my mind. So I think that's super important on the whole journey, for sure.
That's beautiful, Sam. I love your thoughts on that. And that kind of leads me, I guess, to the next question, particularly around as you step into planting, and as you're one who is laboring for the Lord, particularly the last 2 years have just been like something else in terms of the challenges that many of us faced. I know it's been quite complicated in New Zealand in particularly around, and we don't need to delve into the issues, but lockdowns and vaccinations and all the things that you've been working with and through. But one of the things I really appreciate and love about you as a friend, is also as a brother in the Lord and one who I see leading a great church, is you seem to genuinely enjoy ministry. Like, I'm sure there's times where it's obviously tough and it's hard, but there's something about your ministry that I observe as one that is leading from a full place, from the overflow, from one who is doing it out of faith, hope, and joy. And again, I'm sure that's not the case. We always have those shadow sides of the journey of ministry. But I wonder if you just shed some light on, how you've been able to step into a pioneering role, do it from a place of calling and enjoyment, and I guess flourishing in the Lord.
Charlie, that is the highest compliment that you could pay me. I genuinely mean that. Like, it's such I feel a bit emotional just hearing that, because in some ways that's been one of my dreams. It's been like, man, I'd love to be the sort of pastor where people look on from the outside and just go, man, that, like, not easy, but that does look rich, and that guy his soul doesn't look completely munted from the gig, right? And so, and years ago, 15 years ago probably, I remember walking down the road with one of my mates who was just an incredible leader, not leading a church anymore, and we took different paths, but very driven, and just it popped out of me. I was wrestling with why I was feeling sort of there's a bit of tension in this kind of how we were doing it, and it just popped. I was like, mate, I want to build the kingdom the King's way, not the world's way. I want to build the kingdom the King's way. And that's kind of been the thing for me, is like, we have, like, certainly if you're a leader and a pastor and you're like, there's a visionary component to your makeup. There just has to be if you're a leader. And so, and it's like Eugene Peterson said, it can be like a fire in your bones. It's like, oh, I just long to see this. And but the problem is that because of, I think, a lack of discipleship culture in the last 30 years or so, especially, or certainly the generation I grew up, we've kind of had this mindset. I honor the boomers, man. Like, they're just legends. Particularly, I think a lot of them have helped us reclaim some stuff that's gold. But that generation had a work ethic that was really informed by the world's standards, and so it was like a high work ethic. But in terms of margin or Sabbath rest or all those sorts of things, it just wasn't in the conversation 30 years ago. And so I've been like, no, I want to build the kingdom, the King's way, not the world's way. And interestingly, all those boomers that are smart have then worked that out and written things like emotionally healthy spirituality, and written a whole lot of like leading from empty and all, like, they're like, no, actually we've got to rejig this, because this leads to a place where, and again, my thing is like, surely at the center of church, where, pastors and senior leadership teams and all the rest of it, surely there should be great flourishing there. As Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. This spills over to the culture of our church. So, I've got this thing, we're going to be smoking what we're selling. So it's like, I don't know if you guys have got that phrase in Australia, but it's like drug dealers use it, where it's like, which says a little bit about my congregation probably, but you've got to, if you're not smoking what you're selling, then I don't want to buy it, man, because it's like, clearly it's not a good product. And I'm like, are we smoking what we're selling when it comes to the kingdom of God, causing our soul to flourish, love, joy, and peace, the first fruit of the Spirit, and what John talks about, particularly in John 15, as the result of abiding and remaining and having an intimacy with Jesus, that this becomes our predominant experience rather than the rare exception. Like, actually, increasingly, I'm feeling love and joy and peace. Like, so what are the spiritual practices that I need to form in my life to help cultivate that sort of blah, 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 blah. And so I've just been like, man, I want to do the stuff rather than just have the theory, which is like Jesus' big critique at the end of the Sermon on the Mount is like, man, if you want to build your life on the rock, then don't just hear, those that put the stuff into practice are the people that are building their house on the rock. So storm comes, like COVID or church planting or whatever, it's going to be a storm that is going to test your foundations. And so, well, is it strong or not? And it's actually about putting the stuff into practice. So I've been like, you know what, I'm going to do my best to put the stuff into practice. And the two spiritual disciplines especially that have just got me to this point where I feel more and more alive as a pastor and all the rest of it. Yeah, I do have my days for sure. But in terms of trajectory, I'm really happy with how we're tracking. Has been a private life of prayer and Sabbath rest. And so when we went to plant the church, it was like, I'm going to, like, I remember being in a meeting where before we planted with some older folk in our movement, and they're like, if you're not giving 70 hours a week, you're going to struggle to plant a church. You've just got to, for the first couple of years, you've got to just go crazy. And I was just sitting there just going, surely not. Like, no, come on, mate. It just can't be. And then there's other, like, sage of the Vineyard movement, just total, this guy called Gary Best, like total legend. He's like, he just says this, young people are rightly suspicious of a movement that cannibalizes its leaders. And it was like, whoa, bro, hardcore. Like, that's like totally right. I don't want to be in a movement that's cannibalizing its leaders. I'm watching on. So I was like, I don't care if it means a way slower plant or process or whatever, I'm going to have a private life of prayer, and I'm going to take Sabbath super seriously and prioritize my family as we plant. And look, I just don't think we've actually seen any negative aspects to, like, every church wants their pastor healthy. You can spot a mile away on Sunday as they preach and all the rest of it, whether their soul's in a good place or not. And like, I serve my church by tending to my soul. Again, Eugene Peterson, bro. I'm like, let's just read and reread and read and reread his whole philosophy on pastoral ministry. Not that he's perfect, but I'm like, it's a good counterweight to a lot of the stuff that we look to in terms of celebrity and size and all that sort of stuff. So, And also, it turns out that Jesus was right. Who would have thought? You know, I'm like, you do this stuff, and it's like, man, it's really rich. Like, it does feel like life in all of its fullness more and more. So yeah, it's been tricky the last couple of years. A lot of pain, suffering. We've gone through betrayal. We've had hurt. We've had all sorts of stuff. But that anchored in those spiritual disciplines has helped, amongst a whole bunch of other stuff in terms of dealing with grief and spiritual direction and blah 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 blah. But yeah, it's fun, man. It's a privilege to be a pastor, even though it's tricky. And especially today, I'm like, what a privilege that we get to be pastors now with all the pressures on folk and to rediscover spiritual formation and discipleship and all that. Like, man, epic.
It's such a kind of beautiful reminding of what we've committed ourselves to in the church, Sam. You know, like, particularly the gift of pastoral ministry and the gift of advancing the kingdom through building God's church. And of course, it was God who said he would build his church. We're just asked to make disciples. And that's a wonderful reminder. I just love that sense of, health and safety that you bring to that. Even by quoting that, you know, young people are suspicious of a church that cannibalizes its leaders. We don't want to see that in Australia. We want to see healthy, flourishing leadership. Yeah. And I guess that kind of leads to the next question I had, and particularly as one who I'm going to guess is ambitious, because a lot of us are. Like, church planting requires a certain backbone and
healthy ego.
like how would, like, on that, how would you kind of differentiate between ego, what the Lord is calling you to do, you know, that you know, assertiveness and robustness that is required of someone who is breaking new ground? Like, how have you been able to kind of tell the difference between the two and make modifications where necessary?
Yeah, that's such a good question, mate. I remember many years ago, because I've got an ego, mate, absolutely, and ambitious. Sheesh, bro. Like, all I wanted to be was a Christian rock star in my 20s. You know, it was like, I just wanted to be a minor, ideally major Christian celebrity. It was like just sick what was in my heart, even in the mix of a genuine call to ministry. So I knew I had an ego and had some of that stuff from way back, and deep down, actually genuinely want the Jesus way, even though all that other stuff's in the recipe. And so I remember asking a guy in my mid-20s, a very godly British guy that my dad had brought over, having a heart-to-heart with him. I was like, mate, what can I do to walk into humility a lot more? And I was waiting for some little key that would just, you know, I could apply to my life. And he just laughed. He's like, Sam, don't you worry about that. God will sort that out. 15 years later, 100%. Absolutely. God can tidy that up very easily. So in my case, it's like 15 years of apprenticeship, 15 years of serving another person's vision as the lead. That's healthy. I needed that. Other people probably need a lot less than that. I needed 15 years before the Lord could say, okay, now you can lead your thing. And so now, and then it becomes I think what God's done in my life, which I think you see in the life of Joseph, like, he has these dreams. It's just that God refines them so that by the time Joseph's out working that, God's getting the glory, and Joseph's a lot more humble. And that process in the desert place or wilderness, metaphorically speaking, is just so important. We have to embrace those seasons. And I was grateful to have voices in my life that helped me and identify that that's what was going on. And so, and then over the years, certainly in the last sort of 4 years as we've led a church now as a lead pastor, the dreams are there, but they're interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. The dreams have changed from me being a big deal to just like the ache in my heart is that Christ would be formed in my Christian. Like it burns in my heart. I just and so I'm not it's like I'm the rocket pad now. I'm not the rocket ship. I want to see other people. I just want my life to help other people be formed in Christ. And that seems to be the great apostolic vision of the New Testament. You know, Paul is just like, you know, it's like childbirth to see Christ formed in you, or in Colossians, just to see people brought into maturity. And I mean, all throughout the epistles, you just see that. And so then I'm sitting with this thing, because also, but while that's there, I'm also, the visionary in me is thinking long term around. We feel very called to the Hawke's Bay long term. So how can we raise up leaders and plant and do all that sort of stuff over the next couple of decades? All that sort of dynamics going on as well. How can we build a church architecture that's, healthy in terms of discipleship and mission and formation, all that sort of thing. And that's where I think in Philippians it's fascinating, because you've got Paul saying things like in Philippians 4, like, I've learned to be content in all circumstances. And so content's different than being settled. So, there can be the sense of like, I just don't care anymore. That's not what Paul's talking about. Deeply content means that I know whose church it is. It's not mine, it's God's. It means I can Sabbath rest because I'm not addicted to producing the whole time, and Pharaoh's not, my boss. It's like God is, and all that sort of stuff. And I'm deeply grateful for the many blessings that I've got right now, rather than constantly looking to the future and saying, if I've got that, then I'll be happy. And so practicing gratitude and all those sort of things, which I think are super important spiritual disciplines, help be transformed by the renewing of my mind, help train me to see my abundant blessings. I was doing this morning, just jotting down these things, and I do this 3 or 4 times a week. I'm just going to write down stuff I'm grateful for right now. And that just stirs up this deep sense of being content. But then the previous chapter 3, Paul's like, but I'm striving and straining to press forward to that which God has promised me. And it's like, and so you've got this tension that you've got to sit in, where it's like, it's the both. You can have equally both, like a burning in your bones to see the kingdom of God advance and church plant and all this stuff, and simultaneously deeply content about your church currently, your marriage currently, who your kids are, what your car looks like, all the rest of it, your house. I mean, you can just be deeply content around God's many abundant blessings that are all around us. And so, that's kind of my thinking at the moment, is I've got to sit in this tension a little bit, and that God's going to continue to refine me. And so the dreams, like to deeply trust him. Again, that content stuff, it's deeply trust him. If he wants to give me a bigger platform, then he can do that. And if he wants to shut some doors and give away my church, he can do that. It's like, I just want to be an F-post card in the hands of God. And that's a journey of my life, to come to that degree of freedom with how God can use me and will not use me. And to be honest, like, there's been just a lot of not using in terms of what I thought how God could use me over the last 20 years of full-time ministry. But man, I wouldn't trade what God's done in my heart and in my soul for all the tea in China. I would hate to have, I'm so grateful he didn't answer my prayers in my 20s. I shudder to think who I would be if he had said yes to my rock star Christian dreams. I'm just so grateful. It just doesn't compare what he's formed in me through saying no and shutting the door and saying, learn to serve someone else and learn to serve in another minute. Like, I'm so grateful. So I think it's good to have dreams and stuff, but I'm like, he'll sort it out. He'll sort it out. If we stay close to him, he'll sort it out.
Absolutely. One of the questions responses that I often hear out of church planters, and particularly those who have labored, not in vain, but been, to build the church that they feel like God has called them to plant and to build, is particularly around, I guess, even lessons learnt in the first 5 years. And many church planters I talk to, who may only be a couple of years into the journey, go, already I would change so much around what we did or what we built upon, like you talked about that before, Sam. Like, as you reflect back on almost 5 years of planting and leading Bay Vinyard, like, what for you have been the significant building blocks that you would want to prioritize again and again and again, and encourage to other planters who might be in a similar stage or considering planting in the future, and what they should really be tending to in their own journey?
Yeah. I mean, there's things I would do differently. Is that what you're asking? And then what are the things that I just absolutely, I'm stoked I've done, or I would make
Absolutely.
sure.
Yeah.
So the tricky thing the tricky thing when you move into a region and you plant is that you want to give power away if you're a good leader. You want to give power away. You want to empower others to lead and to have some responsibility. The tricky thing is when you plant in a region that you don't have history in, is that you haven't seen people in a few seasons, and you need to see people in a few seasons before you give them a badge or some responsibility. I knew that in theory, but out of both a desire or desperation to try not to have to carry everything, I gave away some stuff a bit too early and didn't take a very good discernment process around who we gave some stuff to. And I paid a high price for that. And so I would be even slower in appointing, people into positions of authority within our church. And it's always a tension, because I'm like, even now I'm like, I got a bit burnt, but I wanted to keep trusting people, and you have to, at some point you do have to risk, and you don't know how it's going to play out, and there's no easy way of just nailing those decisions around stuff. So but that's an important element that I would have done differently in my case. Because of 15 years of stuff that I've been wrestling with, I was pretty clear around how I wanted, for me, all of a sudden it was like, I've got the freedom to be a lead pastor and shape culture, and the buck stops with me in terms of stuff. So there's a cost to being a lead pastor, but there's an incredible privilege in terms of being able to shape culture. And so we started from the out, and God in his mercy brought me across some people like John Mark Comer and John Tyson, and I'd been swimming in Eugene Peterson and Pete Scazzero and Ruth Haley Barton and Dallas Willard for years and years and years, but particularly the more recent addition of, these guys out working that in this cultural moment. The timing of those guys sort of coming on the scene quite prominently was perfect for me, because I was fully convinced around the ecclesiology that they are presenting to pastors around formation and discipleship. And fascinatingly, the three kind of main things that John Tyson has hung his church around, I'd had kind of this, not as good language, they're brilliant at their language, but identical stuff. It was like, so I just felt like I came home in a lot of ways to their apostolic leadership. And so I'm so grateful that we focused on discipleship, particularly from the get-go. And my thing for planting is like, I came out of a church as an executive pastor, thousands of people on a Sunday, big staff team and all the rest of it. So used to scale. And so then it was jarring and tricky to go, we're talking about 10 or 15 people, not, 100, 150 people in terms of whatever we're running. And so my thing is like, man, just do it. Just start it anyway. It doesn't matter what the system is, discipleship structure thing is, just do some stuff just begin to do something that's outworking your passion for the things that the Lord's placed on your heart. Just start it, and you can tweak it as you go and all the rest of it. But I'm like, give it a crack. That's why we're planted, right? To give some stuff a crack. So I'm so grateful that we've just kind of kept on just going deeper on all of that stuff, and it's brought life, and we see a lot of fruit out of that discipleship formation kind of mentality around how we build our church architecture. And a lot of joy to me as I've watched guys and girls, flourish in Jesus. It takes a lot longer than you'd like. Building culture, I thought, because it burns on my bones, I just got to preach a couple of good messages and we're away. It's like, oh no, it turns out you've got to be consistent on message for about 3 or 4 years before folks begin to get, okay, and then you can, but there's a tipping point even in culture when you get to enough people in your church of really understanding, get what who you're trying to be and build, and that the momentum starts to kick in, which is where COVID was tricky and all that, because boom, goodbye momentum. But I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. I love that, Sam. And I guess even some of the things that you're sharing there lead me to our final question today. And I take you as quite a gritty, prophetic leader, one who has a pretty good finger on the pulse. You mentioned some incredible, influences and leaders there just around people who have informed your ministry and your particularly your heart for the church in the West, as we face, becoming a minority culture and the challenges of that, and every context has its unique challenges. But I guess my final question, just because I do trust your voice and opinion on this, is particularly around like what are you seeing, or what would you want to encourage, particularly the church in the West at this time, around opportunities that lay before us, our responses to being a minority culture, like the hopes for the church in 2022 and beyond, just as a concluding encouragement for our audience today.
Oh man, here we go. Man, here's my number one thing I think we've got to do as a church these days, is we've got to teach people to pray. We've got to teach people to sit with Jesus. I think we're underestimating the formation of culture amongst anyone, especially under 45s. Growing up with a cell phone in your pocket as a weapon of mass distraction, blah, blah, blah. You know, we've got this attention economy where billions are spent to get your attention and to keep it. And coupled with the lack of discipleship, we are now in a time where most people under 45 struggle to have any interior depth whatsoever outside of a Sunday. And at best, their devotional rhythms are like running through a shower. It's just, and so I'm like, man, we've got to, now how people do it, I mean, we could talk for another couple of hours on that. I mean, I've got all sorts of ideas, and I'm all ears on any idea that's going to help people learn to have a structured devotional rhythm every day. I'm convinced this is the number one battle we've got to hit, because we can get concerned about the mission, but the mission flows from an interior life with Jesus. So trying to fix mission without sorting this deep interior life with Jesus is just going to lead to more frustration and disappointment in the church, and more Christians feeling like they're rubbish because they're not great evangelists or whatever. I'm like, but I've seen with my own eyes over the last 4 years of our church ticking along, as I have hammered the devotional life stuff. We've got accountability groups. We just spend so much time talking about this and putting structure around our church culture to help facilitate this and teach people that it does spill over to mission. Absolutely. Like, I could tell you story after story from ordinary dudes and dudettes who are doing radical kingdom stuff led by the Spirit, the stuff we dream about as pastors. But I haven't talked about that. All I've talked about is your interior life with Jesus. You've got to have one. You've got to fight for that space. And so for me, I'm like, I think pastors have probably either both underestimated where their guys are at because they've done the work to fight for this themselves, normally because they're sick of feeling like hypocrites. And so they're like, which was kind of how my journey started. I'm tired of feeling like a hypocrite. I've got to get some interior depth. And then you fight for this thing on your own. And then after a while, when it becomes your normal, you lose sight of the fact that actually most of the folk in your church don't have an interior life with Jesus, particularly the under 45s. Or pastors don't have an interior life with Jesus and they feel guilty about it. And how can I lead people to somewhere where I don't actually have the stuff in place in my life? So I'm like, regardless of what it is, this for me is the big hill. This is what I'm just burning with this thing of like, how can I do my best to help other churches cultivate a church culture that sees people have an interior life with Jesus? Because I want to learn from anyone that's doing that, and I'm just constantly just mining anyone to help inform what we do at Bay Vinyard. And man, but the fruit, unreal. It's just like, again, John 15, folks, it was like, it's just, and Jesus himself had to just withdraw to those lonely places. How much more do we need to withdraw to those lonely places daily to be filled afresh with his presence, to be filled with his Spirit, so that we can go into a world now that we're on the fringes, which is a great place for the church to flourish, and carry his presence into broken places and bring his kingdom. So that for me is the number one thing. I think we've really got to do the work on that in our church cultures, and then we can speak to mission, and we can speak to planting and leadership and all the other things that are super important. But it's not a buffet of spiritual practices where you got Sabbath and simplicity and you know what it's like. No, it's actually got the metaphor for me is the foundation of the house. is all about devotional, is the devotional inner world with Jesus. It's the tree planted next to the streams of living water. It's, and all that sort of, and then from there we can build other spiritual practices that see us more in line with the way of Jesus, including how we live missionally in terms of things of the kingdom. So that's my big thing. And we can have another chat another day, maybe around church architecture and how to cultivate that. I've got some ideas because we've been labbing some stuff for the last couple of years and seen a lot of fruit. But again, I'm still a student on this. I'm trying to learn. How can I make it easy for someone that turns up to Bay Vinyard, that's in our community, to, after a couple of years, have a deep walk with the Lord and to be going deeper? And then that's the trajectory for their life. That, for me, it would be a win. That's my dream. That's like, that's the thing that burns in my heart in terms of how we move forward in this cultural moment.
Wow. Sam, you've been an enormous gift to us today. And I just know that anyone who's going to be listening to this podcast for the last X amount of time, you can't help but catch your infectiousness for both the journey of planting the deep formational life that is required of any follower of Jesus, particularly in this cultural moment. And so from an Aussie brother to a Kiwi, thank you so much for being with us today. We greatly appreciate your time, mate.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.